Thank you, Dani, and thanks to all of you for being here. It is a real honor to speak at the 20th World Congress of the International Economic Association and to see several of you here who I've known for many years and also very prominent thinkers in the audience. I think makes this a particularly exciting opportunity for me to give this talk. Thank you. The overarching question of the Congress is, are we at a turning point? I believe we are. In fact, I will take this Congress's question a step further and ask, are we on the brink of Cold War II? The historian Neil Ferguson argues that we already are. If so, what would that mean for the global economy? And how can we preserve the gains from economic cooperation within a more fragmented world? To answer these questions, I will first briefly trace the history of cross-border trade relations during the 20th century. I will then examine the parallels and differences between the Cold War and what we see now. I will describe the signs of fragmentation that we see in trade and investment data so far and discuss the potential economic costs should the fault lines deepen. Finally, I will offer 3 principles for protecting economic cooperation in a more fragmented world. Pandemic, war, and growing tensions between the 2 largest economies of the world, the US and China, have undoubtedly changed the playbook for global economic relations. The US calls for friendshoring, the EU for de-risking, and China for self-reliance. National security concerns are shaping economic policy worldwide. Meanwhile, the global rules-based system was not built to resolve national security-based trade conflicts. So we have countries strategically competing with amorphous rules and without an effective referee. Now, there are benefits for countries of this playbook as they attempt to de-risk their supply chains and strengthen national security. But if not properly managed, the costs could easily overwhelm these benefits and potentially reverse nearly 3 decades of peace, integration, and growth that has helped lift billions out of poverty. With the weakest, let me make sure the slide moves. With the weakest global growth prospects in decades, and with disproportionate scarring from the pandemic and war, slowing income convergence between rich and poor nations, we can little afford another Cold War. Let's start by looking at the history. This is not the first time that globalization has come under threat and geopolitical considerations have fragmented global trade and capital flows. There was an explosion of international trade during the long 19th century, a 125-year period beginning with the French Revolution in 1789. But the First World War brought that golden era of globalization to an abrupt end, with world trade collapsing as a share of income. The protracted economic hardship that followed the war paved the way for the rise of nationalist and authoritarian leaders that later plunged the world into World War II. After World War II, a fragmented bipolar world emerged with 2 superpowers, the US and the USSR, divided by ideology and political and economic structures. Poised precariously between them was a set of non-aligned countries. This Cold War period, which you see shaded in, I guess you can't see the gray over there, this Cold War period between the late 1940s and late 1980s was not a period of deglobalization, as it was marked by rising global trade to GDP, driven by the post-war recovery and the trade liberalization policies adopted by many countries in the Western Bloc. However, it was a period of fragmentation, as trade and investment flows were heavily shaped by geopolitical considerations. Trade between opposing blocs collapsed from around 10 to 15% to less than 5% of global trade during the Cold War. With the end of the Cold War, trade between previously rival blocs expanded rapidly, reaching almost a quarter of world trade in the following decade. The end of the Cold War also coincided with the hyper-globalization period of the 1990s and 2000s. Technological innovations, unilateral and multilateral trade liberalization, and geopolitical and institutional changes all coalesced to lift economic integration to levels not seen before. Since 2008, however, the pace of globalization has stagnated, the so-called slowbalization, with trade to GDP stabilizing as the forces that helped spur hyperglobalization naturally waned. That brings us to the present day. Over the past 5 years, threats to the free flow of capital and goods have intensified as geopolitical risks have grown. Some measures, including tariffs or export restrictions, directly target trade and investment. Other behind-the-border measures indirectly affect trade flows, such as fiscal and financial support to specific domestic sectors and local content requirements. Around 3,000 trade-restricting measures were imposed last year, nearly 3 times the number imposed in 2019. Multinational firms in their earnings calls are increasingly discussing issues such as reshoring, nearshoring, frontshoring, and deglobalization. So are we at the beginning of Cold War II? The key driving force is similar. That is the ideological and economic rivalry between two superpowers. In the Cold War, it was US and Soviet Union. Now it is the US and China. But the stage on which these forces are unleashed is fundamentally different along several dimensions. To start, the degree of economic interdependence between countries now is higher, as economies have become much more integrated into the global marketplace and through complex global value chains. Global trade to GDP is now 60%, compared to 24% during the Cold War. This will likely raise the costs of fragmentation. There is also greater uncertainty on the bloc with which countries may choose to associate. Within-country swings in the ideology of political leadership have increased compared to the Cold War era and make it difficult to pin down allegiances. This uncertainty can further raise costs. On the other hand, the potentially non-aligned countries now have greater economic heft in terms of GDP, trade, and population. For the current period, the analysis considers 2 hypothetical blocks based on countries' voting patterns in the UN and include predominantly the US and Europe in the Western Bloc and China and Russia in the Eastern Bloc, with the rest of the countries considered non-aligned. In 1950, the Western and Eastern blocs together accounted for roughly 85% of global GDP. The 2 blocs that we hypothetically have today account for roughly 70% of GDP and only 1/3 of the world's population. And they have to compete with non-aligned emerging players. Given their increased economic integration, in 2022, more than half of global trade involved a non-aligned country. The non-aligned countries can serve as connectors between rivals. They can benefit directly from trade and investment diversion in a fractured global economy and cushion the negative effect of fragmentation on trade, thereby reducing its costs. Let's next examine the facts about fragmentation. As you will see, there are signs of growing fault lines. Like the period of the Cold War, we do not see meaningful deglobalization, as the share of global trade in world GDP remains relatively stable. But we are beginning to see signs of fragmentation with meaningful shifts in underlying bilateral trading relations. While the growth of trade has slowed everywhere after the war in Ukraine, the growth between blocs that are not politically aligned has slowed more. Specifically, trade growth within blocs has decreased to 1.7% from 2.2% pre-war. Trade between blocs has declined from 3% pre-war to around negative 1.9%. On net, this generates 3.8 percentage points faster growth in trade within blocs as opposed to between blocs. Importantly, this pattern is not limited to just trade in strategic sectors, which are most likely to be targeted by policymakers and potentially helps countries de-risk. It also appears in trade of non-strategic products. There are also clear signs that global foreign direct investment is segmenting along geopolitical lines. Announced FDI projects between blocs declined more than those within blocs after the onset of the war in Ukraine, while FDI to non-aligned countries have sharply increased. In fact, almost 40% of announced FDI projects were in those economies in the third quarter of this year. This occurred alongside the resurgence of trade tensions between the US and China, between whom direct links are being severed. China is no longer the largest trading partner to the US, and its share of US imports have fallen by almost 10 percentage points in 5 years, from 22% in 2018 to 13% in the first half of this year. The trade restrictions imposed since the onset of the US-China trade tensions in 2018 have effectively curbed Chinese imports of tariffed products. China is also no longer a prominent destination for outward US FDI, losing rank to emerging markets such as India, Mexico, and the UAE in the number of announced FDI projects. But there is suggestive evidence that direct links between US and China are simply being replaced by indirect links. Countries that have gained the most in US import share, such as Mexico and Vietnam, have also gained more in China's export shares. The same countries are also larger recipients of Chinese FDI. So there is growing anecdotal evidence of a set of connector countries that are uniquely positioned to benefit from the US strategy of de-risking from China. This is due to factors such as their location, natural endowments, and free trade agreements with both sides. For example, large electronics manufacturers have accelerated relocating production from China to Vietnam, given US tariffs on Chinese goods. However, Vietnam sources most inputs from China, while most exports go to the US. Meanwhile, Mexico eclipsed China as the biggest exporter of goods to the US in 2023. But many manufacturers opening plants in Mexico are Chinese companies, targeting the US market. According to the Mexican Association of Private Industrial Parks, 1 in 5 new businesses in the next 2 years will be Chinese. This anecdotal evidence, along with correlations in the data, point to lengthening supply chains. This is supported by a recent BIS study, which examined data from more than 25,000 companies and found that supply chains have lengthened in the last 2 years, especially those involving Chinese suppliers and US customers. In sum, fragmentation is already a reality as geopolitical alignments shape trade and investment flows, a process that will likely continue. But despite efforts by the two biggest economies to cut ties, it's not yet clear how effective they will be in a deeply integrated and connected global economy. If fragmentation deepens, what would be the economic cost? And how will those costs be transmitted? With trade being the main channel through which fragmentation could reshape the global economy, imposing restrictions on trade would diminish the efficiency gains from specialization, limit economies of scale due to smaller markets, and reduce competitive pressures. The capacity of trade to incentivize within industry reallocation and generate productivity gains would be stifled. Less trade would also imply less knowledge diffusion, a key benefit of integration, which could also be reduced by fragmentation of cross-border direct investment. Fragmentation of capital flows would limit capital accumulation because of lower foreign direct investment and affect the allocation of capital, asset prices, and the international payment system, posing macro-financial stability risks and potentially leading to a more volatile economy. The estimates of the economic costs of fragmentation vary widely and are highly uncertain. But recent and ongoing work at the IMF suggests that these costs could be large and weigh disproportionately on developing countries. If the global economy were to fragment into two blocks based on the UN voting on the 2022 Ukraine resolution and trade between the two blocks were eliminated, global losses are estimated to be about 2.5% of GDP. But depending on economies' ability to adjust, the losses could reach as high as 7% of GDP. At the country level, losses are especially large for lower income and emerging market economies. FDI fragmentation in a world divided into two blocks centered around the US and China, with some countries remaining non-aligned, could result in long-term global losses of around 2% of GDP. As in the case of trade, the losses are larger for less advanced regions, which depend more on inflows from the opposing bloc. But a lot will depend on how exactly trade and investment fracture. If some economies remain non-aligned and continue engaging with all partners, they could benefit from the diversion of trade and investment. Our simulations suggest that if only trade between a US-Europe bloc and a China-Russia bloc is disrupted, the remaining economies will see some gains on average. Latin American countries are well placed to benefit in such a scenario. For example, Mexico's proximity with the US could boost its manufacturing sector, while South America's commodity exporters could gain market shares. But if fragmentation worsens, even those who benefit from fragmentation in its mild forms could be left with a larger slice of a smaller pie in an extreme scenario. In short, everyone would lose. Fragmentation would also inhibit our efforts to address other global challenges that demand international cooperation. The breadth of these challenges, from climate change to AI, is immense. Recent IMF analysis shows that fragmentation of trade in minerals critical for the green transition, such as copper, nickel, cobalt, and lithium, would make the energy transition more costly. Because these minerals are geographically concentrated and not easily substituted, disrupting their trade would lead to sharp swings in their prices, suppressing investment in renewables and EV production. So the question then is, what can policymakers do? At this turning point, policymakers face difficult trade-offs between minimizing the costs of fragmentation and maximizing security and resilience. Pragmatic approaches that preserve the benefits of free trade to the extent possible and safeguard solving global challenges while minimizing distortions are needed. The first best solution, of course, is to avoid fragmentation, but for the time being, this may be difficult to achieve. Absent the best-case scenario, we must work to avoid the worst-case scenario and protect economic cooperation in a more fragmented world. 3 principles can help. First, seek a multilateral approach at the very least for areas of common interest. For example, a green corridor agreement could guarantee the international flow of minerals critical for the clean energy transition. Similar agreements for essential food commodities and medical supplies could ensure minimum cross-border flows in an increasingly shock-prone world. Such agreements would safeguard the global goals of averting climate change devastation, food insecurity, and pandemic-related humanitarian disaster. Second, if some reconfiguration of trade and FDI flows is deemed necessary to de-risk and diversify, a non-discriminatory plurilateral approach can help countries deepen integration, diversify, and mitigate resilience risks. Policymakers should define broadly the set of partners and allies with which to deepen economic partnerships. Plurilateral agreements consistent with the WTO, such as regional trade agreements and joint statement initiatives, while clearly second best, could offer several benefits. These include economies of scale, greater market access, and diversified suppliers, among others. By updating the rules and keeping an open-door policy, such agreements allow new partners to join when they are willing and able to commit to the agreement's rules and norms. Recent examples of regional trade agreements include the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership and the African Continental Free Trade Area. Several joint statement initiatives are currently underway, including on e-commerce, investment facilitation, and services domestic regulation. In December 2021, 70 WTO members agreed on a WTO-based plurilateral agreement on domestic regulation of services. Policymakers should target only a narrow set of products and technologies that warrant intervention on economic security grounds. Before deciding to bring production home, they must carefully consider whether there is truly a lack of supplies from less risky regions and make an objective assessment of the social and economic costs of supply disruptions. This is especially the case for widely used technologies such as semiconductors. Third, restrict unilateral policy actions such as industrial policies to addressing externalities and market distortions and be time-bound. Limit their goal to correcting market failures while preserving market forces where they can allocate resources most efficiently. It is critical to carefully evaluate industrial policies, both in terms of their effectiveness in achieving stated outcomes and the associated economic costs, including cross-border spillovers. Domestically, industrial policies may be hard to limit or roll back given their concentrated benefits and diffused costs. Internationally, such policies may lead to retaliation, which would deepen fragmentation. According to recent IMF estimates, if China introduces a subsidy, the likelihood that the European Union imposes a trade restricting measure within 12 months in response to the subsidy is 90%. An intergovernmental dialogue or a consultation framework on industrial policies could help improve data and information sharing and identify the impact of policies, including their unintended consequences across borders. Over time, steady lines of communication could help develop international rules and norms on the appropriate use and design of industrial policies, making it easier for companies to adjust to the new environment. On each of these 3 principles, we can look for blueprints from the last Cold War. Throughout that period, the US and Soviet Union made several agreements to avoid nuclear catastrophe. Both superpowers subscribed to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, knowing that an attack by one will ultimately lead to total annihilation. If we descend into Cold War II knowing the costs, we may not see mutually assured economic destruction, but we could see and annihilation of the gains from open trade. Ultimately, policymakers must not lose sight of those gains. It is in their and everyone's best interest to advocate strongly for a multilateral, rules-based trading system and the institutions that support it. Of course, economic integration has not benefited everyone. Acknowledging this is critical to understanding additional motivations behind global inward shifts, and domestic policies must adjust to broaden their benefits. But it has helped billions of people become wealthier, healthier, and better educated since the end of the Cold War. The size of the global economy has roughly tripled, and nearly 1.5 billion people were lifted out of extreme poverty. So let me conclude. While there are no signs of broad-based retreat from globalization, fault lines are emerging as geoeconomic fragmentation is increasingly a reality. If fragmentation deepens, we could find ourselves in a new Cold War. The economic costs of Cold War II could be large. The world has become much more integrated, and we face an unprecedented breadth of common challenges that a fragmented world cannot tackle. Yet, even in this new geopolitical reality, policymakers can seek solutions that minimize the costs of fragmentation. The focus should be on pragmatic approaches that preserve the benefits of free trade to the extent possible, safeguard solving global challenges while achieving domestic goals on security and resilience. Keeping open the lines of communications, as is being done by the US, China, and the European Union, can help prevent the worst outcomes from occurring. The non-aligned countries, which are mainly emerging and developing countries, can deploy their economic and diplomatic heft to keep the world integrated. After all, many emerging and developing countries face the biggest losses from a fragmented world, and while some benefit in the early stages of fragmentation, all lose in a full-blown Cold War. As we consider this turning point question over the next few days, I encourage all of us to think about how we can help achieve these solutions through our collaboration, through our research, and this will be critical to preserve what we have achieved and face the global challenges ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gita, for that wonderful presentation. I wonder if we can show the last slide again, because I think that's was the one of the most interesting parts. So I do want sort of for people to be looking at this while we have a little bit of an exchange. I think the point that this if we're going to have a second Cold War, it's going to look very different. I think it's a very important point. There was a sense in which the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and the United States and the West could engage in this geopolitical competition and proxy by war in the developing countries without significantly harming the world economy, because their economic interactions between them was actually so little to begin with coming out of the Second World War. So you could have a fairly integrated world economy, leaving of course the Soviet bloc aside, but sort of relatively prosperous and expanding trade and long-term investment with very significant strategic and geopolitical competition between the Soviet Union and the West. Today, of course, it's hard to imagine what that would be, because if you have that kind of a strategic and geopolitical competition and a true Cold War with China, and that also translates into, and as it would have to, spills over into economic relations, and all economic relations start to be viewed from a zero-sum perspective as opposed to a positive-sum perspective that we're used to as economists, then everything becomes, weaponized for, for the purposes of geopolitical advantage, and that, as you stressed, would be very, very costly outcome for the world economy. Now, but there's, I think, maybe the positive spin on that would be that precisely because there is so much interdependence to begin with, that we're unlikely to see the kind of sort of an extreme decoupling or a de-risking that would really sort of significantly spill over into the the bulk of consumer goods and intermediate goods and so forth, and maybe just carve out some domains of national security interests sort of as areas of decoupling and de-risking, but most of the rest of the trade with China still continue along those lines. So, do you see that as a possible outcome, that's, there's a kind of a demarcation of those relatively sort of narrower national security sensitive areas from the rest of the trade?
That is the strategy that countries are following. I think, again, there is very good reason for countries to worry about supply chain disruptions, about resilience, about de-risking. I think there's no doubt about that. We have a world which is incredibly integrated down to the minutiae, and that could generate risk. So that, I don't think anybody is disputing that, which is why some of these policies can be helpful to build resilience. The aim is to target strategic sectors. The concern, and that's one of the points I made, is that you are seeing a decline in trade across the blocks. That's not just in the strategic sectors, but also in the non-strategic sectors. And it's that slippery slope that we have to prevent from happening. It is very hard because when you're in a world where you have more amorphous rules of engagement, I think companies will extrapolate from narrow considerations to wondering whether they should have a large amount of exposure to a particular country. So that spills over more generally into other countries, and we are seeing that in the data. The second piece, of course, is I think we have another parallel big transformation that's going on with artificial intelligence and technology, and that is seeping into every space of work that we do, and there is a risk that it's going to be hard to ring-fence very narrow sectors.
I'm going to ask Gita a couple more questions, but I will turn to the audience if you have some brief questions. I know this is a huge audience, and I don't know whether we'll manage to do that. But if you have a question that you want to ask, if you can, try to formulate it in as brief as possible over the next few minutes, then I'll turn to the audience. Let me ask you a question about this. That you said that, rightly, that trade and investment flows across blocks is going down, and that's as a source of concern. I wonder if these volume measures don't overestimate what the true costs are. Because when I think about sort of what's the consequence, suppose the world gets divided up into three blocks, sort of US and North Atlantic and sort of, middle-income countries and developing countries and China and a few close allies. So the true cost of that in terms of, welfare or growth really would have to be what are the sort of losses in possible gains from trade. And those relate to things like, what are the sources of underlying comparative advantage, the possibilities of scale, and so forth. Now, as long as you have these very large blocks that can still have very wide discrepancies in underlying, shapers of comparative advantage, as long as they're very large so that they can still reap the scale economies. After all, we don't necessarily think that you need to operate on a global scale to maximally reap those increasing scale effects, that you can have a lot of reduction in the volume of trade without much reduction in the gains from trade. and maybe, so I don't know what the mechanics of the IMF model there is, and maybe the fact that the gains that or the losses that you showed for the West is actually pretty small, and I presume that has to do something with that. They're really not losing a whole lot by just trading more with each other. Is that correct? Or?
So the question of how costly all of this can be, you're right, at this point it is uncertain. We have simulations that can show the costs range from very low numbers, even for the world as a whole, to very large numbers, depending upon the form fragmentation takes, how many blocks there are, how entrenched are countries with each block. I mean, all of those matter, how substitutable the goods are. To ultimately end up with a calculation, all of those parameters matter. And so it is unclear. The risk the reason that the losses are likely to be in any of these scenarios greater for emerging and developing countries as a whole, not for a specific country, but as a whole than for advanced economies is, first, they tend to rely more on trade with countries that are not necessarily part of that they have affinities with. And secondly, an important part of all of this economic interaction is transfer of knowledge. And they get hit harder when you don't get this transfer of knowledge. Another factor is, if you look at some specific sectors, I think we can become maybe a little more specific. Like, for instance, certain commodities. There it's very clear, there are certain places where you can mine these commodities. It's not going to be very easy to immediately duplicate that in some other part of the world. And so you can see the costs of that for the climate transition, for individual, especially for developing countries that also rely quite a bit on imports of these commodities. So one can get into narrower sectors and commodities and come up with a little more precise estimate, and those costs are still quite large and very worrisome. But you're right, I don't think anybody here should say that the minute you start worrying about de-risking, you're going to have a huge efficiency loss. I don't think that's the statement.
So I'm going to keep us a little bit longer because we started later, so we have a half an hour coffee break, I think, so I'm going to go a little bit into the coffee break while we have, just can abuse, Gita's patience a little bit more. So one of the, as you just said, I think it's particularly important for the developing countries to keep trade and investments links open with the other blocs, because they would be the major losers. And I think that's sort of one of the key messages that I take from the numerical simulations is that how important it is for the developing countries to maintain links with both sides. And I think the importance of that, of course, is that they're going to come politically under increasing pressure to choose sides, right? I mean, the US is already engaged in it, and China will engage in it, and I think that's a source of major possible loss. Let me, just as a final question to you before I see if there are burning questions from the audience. On the third item here, on unilateral policy actions, I want to challenge you a little bit on this by sort of, drawing sort of a comparison with Cold War I or the Bretton Woods period, when in fact countries did have significantly more policy room to engage in these unilateral policy actions, including industrial policies, where the global disciplines were virtually non-existent. And yet this was a period, as your numbers showed, where trade and long-term investment expanded, and there was a lot of globalization that was taking place. It was a very, the environment, global environment was, sort of quite conducive to countries that were engaged in export-oriented industrialization, such as the East Asian tigers and so forth. So how much do we have to really be concerned about these unilateral policy actions when we have the experience of the Bretton Woods period, when in fact, allowing countries to solve their domestic economic and social problems through a lot of policy space did not do that much damage to the global economy?
Yeah, obviously that period of Bretton Woods comes after the Second World War, and there was a whole lot that was involved with just recovering from two major wars. And so there was a lot of low-hanging fruit, I would say, in terms of getting that increase in trade and growth. And I think all of that is very valuable. In terms of kind of the range of unilateral policy actions, again, I'm going to pick one. I'm going to talk about industrial policies. You've thought about this. I think it's fair to say that the jury is still out on the costs and the benefits, and it is very hard. It's a very tricky exercise to truly identify and say, well, this policy helped the country in its growth. And you can also flip that around and say that you can't say that this policy was costly for this country either, right? So there's a lot that's unknown. But what we do know is that when you do industrial policy in a way, and you're a country where you start off with weak governance, usually you end up with, frankly, any reform failing. It's not just industrial policy, but any structural reform fails if you don't have good governance. And the temptation to do industrial policies tend to show up in countries where there's weaker governance, which means there's more rent-seeking behavior, there's more capture of profits. And these these costs are absolutely salient. And we see this among the many countries that we deal with in our surveillance. So I think if you can do incredibly smart industrial policy where you have good governance, you're able to target a market failure, keep it time-bound, that is perfectly reasonable way to go. The problem, again, is that I think for most countries who are trying to use this, especially among emerging and developing countries, these governance issues are big.
I mean, yet when countries fail on their monetary and fiscal policies or financial regulations, the IMF doesn't go and tell them, don't do these policies. They say, let's show you how to do it better, right? So it's not clear why, in the case of industrial policy, maybe it's not the IMF, but the World Bank shouldn't go and tell them how to do it better.
I think on monetary and fiscal policy, by the way, to be clear, we also point out when there are inconsistencies and there are problems with it. And I think of monetary and fiscal policy in basic macro management. I think it benefits the country as a whole. Industrial policy tends to have a small group of people who benefit from it, and maybe that's probably one of the reasons why we could be a little more hesitant.
Okay, so let's see. Do I see any hands shooting up? I do. I saw two people. I won't be able to call on too many people, so I'll go with Peter and Dani, and then one other question there, and we'll see how it goes. So can I just ask your questions quickly? Yeah. And then let's take it all in. I wonder if you need a microphone. Is there a microphone? And I think we'll have to stop with these because I do think people need a break. So why don't you start? Hey, here's the microphone coming on the back. Yep.
Thank you very much. So you mentioned at the end of your talk you wanted to have advice for, what the various players could do within this disaster scenario that you're concerned about. Let me raise a set of issues, or one issue, which the IMF itself could and perhaps should do, and a topic that you did not raise as to what the IMF should do in this context. One way to address...
Can you be very quick?
Yes,
because
it'll be very quick.
Yeah, thank you.
Is to address the problems. In your programs, you almost universally raise primary surplus targets beyond best peer practice of countries in similar GDP per capita neighborhoods. That is significantly growth impairing over the medium term from the supply side. If you're worried from this framework about prospects for the developing world, something the IMF could do is stop prioritizing the preservation of debt in its programs and start prioritizing the preservation of growth. Do you comment?
We'll take them all together.
Thank you, Dani, and thank you, Gita, for a wonderful presentation. Danny Quah, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. My question has to do with the Cold War analogy that you're drawing. Cold War I seemed to be characterized not just by there being minimal trade between the blocs, but actually Cold War I seemed to be a variable that was exogenous relative to trade. It was about one side saying we were for democracy and freedom and accusing the other side of being for tyrannism and totalitarianism. Today's Cold War, the way you've described this, has an interlink, not just because the two blocs trade so much, but because the issues that have emerged in the discussion of a Cold War are inextricably linked with economics. And I wonder if that factors into your modeling. Thank you.
Thank you. One final question or comment, if you can be brief there, over there.
Dani Garcia, Universidad de Antioquia. Fascinating presentation. Thank you. My question is, you talked about fragmentation. In terms of the GDP to trade indicator, what's our goal? What number? 80%, 90%, 60%, to be more specific. And secondly, the commanding heights. In developing countries, our worries are about the commanding heights. That's one element that's very important for us when it comes to international trade. Who owns the means of production is very important to us. Could you comment on that as well? Thank you. The means of production. What I mean is that in developing countries, for us, that's very important because that's going to condition the possibility of development for local communities. So the commanding heights are very important for us. Integration sometimes means that we will not have the property of those means of production. Thank you.
So, Rita, I leave it to you to combine somehow these diverse questions and give us some concluding comments.
Yeah, no, just very quickly, I think to the gentleman who asked about IMF's fiscal policy advisors as part of our program context, I think we're going to have a long engagement on this because we clearly see differently what the impact of this advice is on growth and relative to the counterfactual. So that I think we seem to be in different places there. The question on, Danny's question on economics being a bigger deal now, that's right. I think that's related to what Danny said, which is that is probably one of the reasons why the two superpowers remain engaged. They want to set a floor on relations because they have very close economic ties. So that certainly makes it much harder to simply just walk away. I think there are much closer ties in there. And then the third, and I think an important point which I made was that the so-called non-aligned bloc, which was much, in terms of its relative size and heft, was much weaker than it is now. And that makes a very important difference too. What should we aim for trade to GDP? I don't think there is such a, I'm not going to, if I step back, I'm going to say it's going to be a function of, the technologies that we have to be able to trade, the services, in the rules of the game, and so on. I don't think this period when we saw trade to GDP slow down, before what I described now, I wouldn't point to that and say that that was a terrible problem. I think it is, we had a period of hyperglobalization, but there are limits to how much more you can see trade to GDP going up. Now, I don't know whether this is the right number. We could see it going up more if we can get services trade to be done even more liberalized than we have right now. But you're right, I think it is for developing countries. In the past, it has been a source of important income. Economic integration has been a source of income that has helped raise different communities up. Not everybody has benefited, and that is an important challenge for governments to face. But it's exactly why emerging and developing countries should be using their diplomatic heft, their economic heft, to speak out on the global stage and make the case for economic integration.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Gita for the presentation, for giving us so much to think about.
Reciban de nuevo la más cálida bienvenida a EAFIT y a este encuentro, que esperamos sea un espacio de intercambio de ideas y de conversación, a partir de que podamos encontrar de manera conjunta soluciones para los desafíos de nuestra sociedad. Una feliz tarde para todos.